Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we will journey to the winding, uneven streets of Colonial Bogotá, a place of thin mountain air, soft fog clinging to the tiles of red-roofed houses, and the slow rhythm of life unfolding high in the Andes. The year might be 1720, or perhaps 1780, it does not matter so much. Time here moves differently. It drips, like water spilling from the lip of a heavy clay jar. This is not the Bogotá of bustling traffic and bright modern storefronts. This is a city of narrow lanes laid in cobblestones, their edges softened by centuries of rain. Of plazas lined with solemn churches and the low murmur of market stalls. And, above all, of people, craftsmen and merchants, priests and soldiers, enslaved Africans and indigenous laborers, each bound to the patterns of their day. Our focus tonight is on a figure rarely sung about in history books, the water carrier. They were the quiet circulatory system of the city, bringing life from the cold rivers and public fountains into the kitchens, wash basins, and clay jars of every household. To carry water in Colonial Bogotá was to be invisible yet indispensable, your work as constant as the mountain mists that drifted down each evening. We will follow them first through their daily rounds, hauling full barrels through muddy streets, avoiding the slipping hooves of mules, and bracing against the chill that seeps into wet clothes. Then, we will turn our gaze to the rumble of discontent that rose among common people during the revolt of the Comuneros, when ordinary men and women challenged the weight of colonial authority. Later, we will descend into mystery, to the sacred gold offerings known as tunjos, lost beneath the still waters of ancient lakes. And finally, we will step quietly across the threshold of a Spanish colonial mansion, into cool courtyards and rooms lit by chandeliers, where every polished surface hides the labor of those forced to maintain them. So, let your breathing slow. Picture the cool, damp morning in a city perched high in the mountains, where water is more than a necessity, it is the pulse of daily life. Our journey begins here. Imagine the first light of day, pale and tentative, stretching over the distant green ridges that cradle the city. Bogotá in colonial times sat over 2,600 meters above sea level, and the mornings were always cool, often laced with mist. For a water carrier, this early hour was not a moment of leisure. It was the start of a long, unbroken chain of tasks that demanded both strength and patience. The city's homes did not have running water. Instead, water was drawn from public sources, springs on the edges of the settlement, small stone fountains fed by aqueduct channels, or, for those near the outskirts, directly from the Rio San Francisco or Rio San Agustin. These rivers flowed cold from the mountains, their currents swift even in the dry season. To step into them was to feel an instant ache in the bones. A water carrier's day began with preparation. First came the mules or donkeys, patient creatures whose breath steamed in the chill air. Clay jars, called tenages, or wooden barrels bound with metal hoops were secured to pack frames, balanced carefully so they would not tilt and spill. A length of rope or woven fiber held everything in place. The journey to the water source was often long, and always muddy. Bogotá's streets, in the 17th and 18th centuries, were prone to deep puddles, especially after the near-daily rains. The shoes worn by carriers were simple, often leather sandals, and would quickly soak through. The smell of wet earth mixed with the sharper sense of mule dung and wood smoke from kitchen fires beginning to burn in nearby homes. At the fountain or riverbank, there was often a wait. Other carriers arrived, some serving private households, others delivering to taverns, bakeries, or small shops. Conversations were quiet, almost murmured, carried over the steady splash of water being ladled into jars. The tools for filling were basic, gourds, buckets, or scoops carved from wood. Each jar might hold several dozen liters, and once full, it became a weight that pressed into the spine, the shoulders, and the hips of both animal and man. The walk back into the city required careful navigation. Streets here were narrow, some barely wide enough for two mules to pass. Drainage channels, dug shallow along the sides, carried away wastewater but could be treacherous to step over. The air was alive with the sound of hoofbeats on stone, the creak of cart wheels, and the occasional call from a street vendor already hawking bread, maize, or fruit. By midday, the water carrier might have made 2 or 3 such trips. Their clothes, even in sunshine, often stayed damp from splashes. The chill of this was constant, a quiet, creeping discomfort that few noticed until their hands stiffened and their breath came out in visible puffs even in the supposed warmth of the day. The work was steady, repetitive, but it carried a quiet rhythm. One could mark the hours by the angle of the light on the plaza walls, by the bells that tolled from church towers at certain intervals. For the water carrier, each delivery meant a brief exchange, a doorway opened, a clay jug lifted from mule to doorstep, a coin pressed into calloused fingers. The faces they saw belonged to the full range of colonial society, the finely dressed mistress of a merchant household, the barefoot servant of a modest inn, the elderly widow who could only afford a small jar at a time. In this way, the carrier became a silent observer of the city's patterns. They saw which homes entertained guests late into the night, by the empty jugs left out in the morning. They knew which kitchens baked bread daily and which inns went through barrels of water faster than they could be refilled. Their labor was woven invisibly into the fabric of Bogotá, a service without which the daily comfort, hygiene, and even survival of the city would falter. By evening, the pace slowed. The last deliveries were made to those who preferred to draw fresh water before nightfall. The streets grew quieter, the shadows lengthened, and the lamps, oil-fed and flickering, cast halos on damp cobblestones. The water carrier returned the mules to their modest shelter, checked the ropes, and stacked the empty jars for the next day. There was no ceremony to the ending of this work. Only the steady awareness that tomorrow, the cycle would begin again, as it always had. And yet, in the soft exhaustion that came after a day's labor, there was a kind of peace, the satisfaction of having kept the city's lifeblood flowing, unseen and uncelebrated, but essential all the same. As the 18th century wore on, Bogotá, and the entire viceroyalty of New Granada, found itself under growing strain. The Spanish crown, stretched thin by wars in Europe and the constant expense of maintaining its empire, sought to extract more revenue from its colonies. Taxes rose, regulations tightened, and new monopolies were enforced. For the water carrier, the baker, the tailor, the farmer, these changes were felt not in distant decrees, but in the price of salt, the cost of tobacco, and the constant presence of officials sent to ensure that the crown received its due. The people who lived under these rules did not often have the means to challenge them directly. But in 1781, something began to shift. The spark came in Socorro, a small town far north of Bogotá, where local weavers and artisans were angered by increased taxes on cotton goods and a new demand for payment in hard coin, which many rural communities lacked. The protest spread quickly. Men and women alike took to the streets, refusing to pay the new levies. Their defiance gathered momentum, and before long, delegations of ordinary citizens were calling themselves comuneros, members of a common cause. The movement was not confined to the towns where it began. Messages traveled along the dusty roads, carried by muleteers, merchants, and even the occasional sympathetic priest. By the time news reached Bogotá, the rebellion had grown into something larger, a march of thousands moving south toward the capital, their numbers swelling with farmers, craftsmen, and small traders from the countryside. Imagine the city at that moment. The plazas, usually given over to market stalls and casual conversation, now thronged with rumors. In the bakeries, people lowered their voices to discuss the latest reports. Were the comuneros truly on the march? Were they armed? Would they reach the city walls? For the authorities, the unrest was troubling. The colonial administration depended on order, on the smooth collection of taxes and the obedience of the population. But for many in the lower ranks of society, there was a quiet, unspoken sympathy. Even those who did not join the movement could understand the frustration of paying ever more while receiving little in return. The comuneros, as they approached Bogotá, carried with them petitions rather than cannons. Their demands were written in careful, almost deferential language, yet they were clear: repeal the new taxes on goods like tobacco and aguardiente, loosen trade restrictions, and address the injustices that had built up over years of neglect. Negotiations began at a place called Zipaquira, a salt mining town north of the city. There, colonial officials and the leaders of the movement met face to face. Accounts tell of crowded gatherings in which the voices of common people, often silenced in official matters, were suddenly heard in public debate. For a moment, it seemed as if compromise might prevail. An agreement was drafted, the Capitulaciones de Zipaquira. It promised to reduce taxes and ease certain restrictions. The comuneros, believing their cause had been heard, began to disperse. But in the weeks that followed, the promises began to unravel. Officials in Bogotá and Cartagena, under pressure from the crown, refused to ratify many of the concessions. Leaders of the movement were arrested or forced into hiding. For those who had marched, the sense of betrayal was deep, but the tools for sustained resistance were scarce. Life in the colony required most to return to their trades, their fields, or their small shops. The cycle of daily labor resumed, as it always did. And yet, something had shifted. The comuneros' revolt had shown that ordinary people could organize across towns and regions, that grievances could be spoken aloud in the open. Though it failed in the short term, it left behind an undercurrent of awareness, a quiet knowledge that the colonial order was not as unshakable as it seemed. In the years that followed, that undercurrent would join others, the ideas of the Enlightenment carried from Europe, the growing discontent in other Spanish colonies, and the example of revolutions abroad. For Bogotá's water carriers, bakers, and artisans, these were still distant currents. But somewhere in the marketplace, as a jar of water was set down or a loaf of bread exchanged, someone would recall the year the comuneros marched and wonder what might come next. And while the city's life returned to its familiar rhythm, the tolling bells, the evening mists, that memory, like a drop of water on stone, continued its slow, quiet work. Long before the first Spanish ships touched the Caribbean coast, before Bogotá's cobbled streets and whitewashed churches rose in the mountain basin, this land was home to the Muisca people. They lived in scattered chiefdoms across the high plateau, cultivating maize, weaving cotton, and shaping gold into forms both intricate and symbolic. Among the most intriguing relics of their culture are tunjos, small gold figurines, usually no more than the length of a finger. Some were human in form, standing stiffly with outstretched arms. Others depicted animals, frogs, birds, serpents, each carrying meaning in the Muisca worldview. The gold itself, called tumbaga, was often an alloy, its reddish hue deepened by copper. These tunjos were not ornaments to be worn, nor currency to be traded. They were offerings, gifts to the gods and the spirits of sacred places. Many were cast into lakes, especially those believed to be portals to the divine. The still waters of Lake Guatavita, Lake Siecha, and others became shimmering repositories of devotion, each gold figure sinking slowly into the cool depths. Imagine the scene centuries ago, dawn breaking over a highland lake, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and grasses. A small group approaches the shore. The priest, clothed in cotton and adorned with feathered headdress, chants softly. In his hands, a basket holds gleaming shapes, tiny humans, delicate animals, symbols of fertility, harvest, and protection. One by one, they are cast into the water, each making a small splash before disappearing beneath ripples. To the Muisca, gold was not mere wealth. It was the sweat of the sun, a sacred substance that carried spiritual power. Offering it to the lake was an act of balance, giving back to nature what was most precious, ensuring the harmony of the world. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they heard whispers of these treasures resting in the depths. The legend of El Dorado, the Golden One, grew from such stories, mingling fact and fantasy. Expeditions were mounted to drain or dredge the lakes, often with crude, destructive methods. In 1580, an attempt to cut a channel into Lake Guatavita lowered its level enough to reveal a rim of mud where a handful of gold objects were recovered. Many more, however, remained hidden in the deeper waters. Over the centuries, other attempts were made. Some brought up small caches of tunjos, their surfaces dulled by centuries underwater, yet still bearing the delicate patterns of their makers' hands. Each discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Were the figures intended for specific gods? Did their shapes correspond to the wishes or prayers of those who offered them? Even today, the mystery endures. Archaeologists study the surviving pieces in museums, tracing the fine lines of noses, eyes, and limbs with careful tools. Divers who have descended into the cold, green depths of sacred lakes speak of low visibility, shifting silt, and the quiet pressure of the water. The idea that thousands of offerings might still rest undisturbed beneath the surface continues to draw both scholars and the curious. For colonial Bogotá, the existence of such treasures was both a temptation and a reminder. Temptation, because gold could be melted, weighed, and sold. Reminder, because each tunjo was a fragment of a world the Spanish could never fully replace, a culture whose beliefs ran deep into the land itself. In the cool evenings, when mist drifted in from the hills and settled over the rooftops, it was easy to imagine those gold figurines lying silently in the silt, bathed in the filtered light of a world untouched by the city's noise. They are part of a past that hums quietly beneath the surface of modern life, much like the water in the clay jars carried through Bogotá's streets, unseen, but always there. Step now from the muddy, crowded streets of colonial Bogotá into the cool shadow of a grand house. The wooden door, thick and weathered, swings inward on iron hinges. Immediately, the sounds of the city, the bray of mules, the murmur of market sellers, the uneven rhythm of boots on stone, fade into a softer hush. Inside, the air is cooler, touched with the faint scent of beeswax from polished furniture and the sharper note of fresh lime wash on the walls. You stand in a wide entrance hall paved with terracotta tiles, their reddish surface worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Light filters in from a central courtyard, a rectangle of open sky around which the mansion is built. This courtyard is the heart of the house. In its center, a stone fountain trickles steadily, the sound blending with the rustle of leaves from potted orange trees. Around the edges, covered walkways lead to the rooms, the salon, the dining room, the bedrooms, each one arranged for both comfort and display. In the salon, heavy wooden chairs carved with floral patterns sit against the walls. Their cushions, upholstered in woven wool or imported damask, bear the subtle scent of cedar from the chests where they are stored when not in use. On the walls hang religious paintings, saints rendered in solemn colors, their gold leaf halos catching the afternoon light. A crucifix occupies a place of prominence, reflecting the deeply Catholic identity of the colonial elite. The dining room is a space of long meals and measured conversation. A massive table, polished to a deep sheen, runs almost the length of the room. Pewter plates and ceramic dishes from Spain or Puebla rest in neat arrangements, ready for guests. Above, a chandelier of wrought iron holds thick beeswax candles, their flames softening the edges of the room when lit in the evening. But behind this display of refinement lies another layer of the household, the labor that keeps it functioning. Much of it is unseen, carried out by enslaved Africans, indigenous servants, or free laborers bound by debt or necessity. They move quietly through the corridors, drawing water from the courtyard fountain to fill yours, carrying trays laden with food, sweeping dust from the tiles before the master of the house returns from his duties. In the kitchen, removed from the formal rooms, the atmosphere is different. Here, the air is warm from the heat of clay ovens, and the smell of maize dough mingles with that of simmering stews. Large earthen jars of water stand ready for cooking and washing. Copper pots, their bases darkened by fire, hang from hooks against the walls. The sound of a wooden pestle striking maize in a mortar is steady, almost rhythmic. Upstairs, the bedrooms are simple but spacious. Wooden beds with high carved headboards stand under mosquito nets, their linen sheets cool to the touch. Chests at the foot of the beds hold garments, cotton shirts, wool cloaks for the cold mornings, perhaps a silk shawl for special occasions. A small writing desk, its surface worn, might hold an inkwell and a few folded letters sealed with wax. From the balcony above the courtyard, one can look down to see the entire rhythm of the household at once, a servant carrying firewood, a child chasing a cat along the walkway, a cook stepping out to pluck herbs from a small planter. The fountain continues to spill water into its stone basin, unchanged by the comings and goings. Life in such a mansion was ordered and deliberate. Meals were taken at set times, visits received with proper ceremony, religious observances kept with care. Yet the walls, thick as they were, did not entirely shut out the world beyond. The sound of church bells drifted in, marking the hours. On market days, the faint echo of voices from the plaza carried over the rooftops. And when rain came, as it so often did, the steady drumming on the clay tiles filled every corner of the house with its gentle insistence. In the quiet of evening, as candles were lit and the courtyard dimmed to shadow, the mansion seemed almost to float above the city's noise. But beyond its doors, the streets remained muddy, the air damp, and the water carriers still made their rounds. Inside was refinement, outside was labor. Together, they formed the two halves of colonial Bogotá's life, one visible, celebrated, and remembered, the other unseen, essential, and often forgotten. Every colonial city had its center, a place where politics, commerce, faith, and rumor converged. In Bogotá, this was the Plaza Mayor, a wide, open square that lay like a stage at the heart of the city's daily life. Its edges were marked by the most important buildings of the colony, the cathedral, the cabildo or town hall, and the residences of the most influential citizens. In the early morning, the plaza was still and cool. The cobblestones, laid unevenly, glistened faintly from the night's mist. Gradually, it began to stir, first with the sweep of a broom across stone, then with the creak of wooden shutters being opened. Merchants arrived pushing carts or leading mules, their panniers heavy with goods. The scent of fresh bread from nearby ovens mingled with the sharper aroma of curing leather, fresh-cut herbs, and the tang of salted fish brought up from the Magdalena River. By mid-morning, the square was alive. Indigenous farmers from the surrounding countryside spread woven cloths on the ground and arranged their produce, bright red peppers, bundles of maize, squash with skins mottled in yellow and green. African and mestizo traders offered sugar, honey, and aguardiente. Artisans displayed their wares, shoes, iron tools, hand-woven belts, and clay cooking pots. The plaza was not merely a place of buying and selling, it was where news traveled. Messengers from other towns might arrive dusty from the road, carrying letters or verbal accounts of distant events. Officials made announcements here, their words carrying over the murmur of the crowd. On certain days, proclamations from the crown or the viceroy were read aloud, the language formal and deliberate, instructing the citizens in matters of law, tax, and order. Religious life also touched the plaza. From the cathedral's bell tower, the tolling of the hour mingled with the lower notes of other nearby churches, creating a web of sound that threaded through the day. Processions sometimes began here, lines of clergy and lay people carrying statues or relics, the smell of incense drifting above the crowd. Yet the plaza could be a place of tension as well. In times of scarcity, prices rose sharply, and murmurs of discontent passed from stall to stall. The Comunero's revolt, decades later, would find fertile ground for its ideas in such public gatherings. The very openness of the square, its function as a meeting point, made it a space where grievances could be spoken aloud, even if only in low tones. On quieter afternoons, when the crowds had thinned and the sun was high, the plaza settled into a more languid rhythm. A child might chase a stray dog along the edges, or a lone rider might cross diagonally, the sound of hooves echoing. Shadows lengthened across the stones as the day began to cool. By evening, vendors packed away their goods, and the square emptied, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the faint scent of the day's commerce. From the balcony of a nearby house, one could watch the transformation of the plaza across the hours, from stillness to noise, from chaos to calm. It was, in every sense, the city's open diary, its entries written in movement, scent, and sound. And though the faces changed and the goods varied with the seasons, the plaza's role remained constant, a steady pulse at the heart of colonial Bogotá. Not far from the busy plaza, behind thick walls and heavy wooden gates, were the convents, self-contained worlds where the rhythm of life followed the toll of bells rather than the noise of the streets. In colonial Bogotá, these religious houses were not only places of worship, but also centers of education, charity, and sometimes quiet political influence. From the outside, a convent presented a simple, almost severe facade. Whitewashed walls rose high above the street, broken only by small, shuttered windows. A single doorway, framed in stone, marked the entrance. Through it, one stepped into a different world, a space where the air felt cooler and the sounds were hushed. Inside, the first sight was often a cloister, a square courtyard surrounded by covered walkways. Along these paths, the scent of flowering plants mixed with the faint perfume of candle wax drifting from the chapel. A central fountain murmured softly, its trickle echoing against the columns. Here, the sisters walked in measured steps, their habits brushing the smooth tiles. The daily life of the nuns followed a strict order. The bell rang before dawn, calling them to the first prayers of the day. In the chapel, lit by flickering oil lamps, their voices joined in chant, slow, steady, each note lingering in the cool air. Afterward came time for study, work, or silent reflection. Some convents taught young girls from prominent families, instructing them in reading, embroidery, and religious devotion. Others produced goods to sustain their community, woven cloth, herbal remedies, or baked sweets sold discreetly to visitors. In all, the emphasis was on modesty and discipline, a life devoted to service and contemplation. Meals were taken together in the refectory, often in silence, while a designated reader recited passages from scripture or the lives of saints. The food was plain but nourishing: maize porridge, stews of beans or lentils, bread baked in the convent ovens. Water, carried in from the city's fountains, was stored in clay jars kept cool in shaded corners. For the nuns, the outside world was both near and far. The noise of market days could be faintly heard through the walls, and letters from family members arrived on occasion. But the daily concerns of the city, politics, trade disputes, gossip, rarely breached the convent's enclosure. Life here was measured in the changing seasons of the courtyard garden, the blooming and withering of flowers, the slow wearing of the tiles beneath sandaled feet. Visitors entered only with permission, and conversation took place through a wooden grill, preserving the separation between the enclosed life and the bustling streets beyond. Yet the convents were connected to the wider city in quieter ways. They offered alms to the poor, took in orphan children, and sometimes acted as safe havens during unrest. As evening fell, the final prayers were said in the dim light of the chapel. The sisters returned to their cells, small rooms with simple wooden beds, a crucifix on the wall, and perhaps a single book. Outside, the city settled into its own rhythm, the mules and water carriers still moving through the damp streets. Inside, the convent sank into silence, broken only by the sound of the fountain in the cloister and the distant toll of the cathedral bells. Life within those walls was far removed from the markets and plazas, yet it was part of the same city, another thread in the quiet tapestry of Colonial Bogotá. Tucked away from the Grand Plaza and the shadow of the cathedral, there was a part of Colonial Bogotá where the air smelled faintly of sawdust, coal smoke, and drying clay. This was the craftsman's quarter, a cluster of workshops where skilled hands shaped the raw materials of the highland plateau into the tools, furnishings, and household goods the city depended on. The streets here were narrower still, their cobbles patched in places with worn planks to bridge muddy stretches. Open doorways revealed dim interiors where workbenches stood crowded with tools. The sounds were steady but never hurried, the measured tap of a hammer against iron, the rasp of a file smoothing a wooden edge, the soft thud of a potter's hands pressing clay into shape. The carpenter's shops were places of warm, resin-scented air. Planks of cedar and pine leaned against the walls, some freshly sawn, others plain smooth and waiting to become doors, tables, or storage chests. Wooden shavings curled on the floor like thin ribbons. The craftsmen worked slowly, using hand planes and chisels sharpened against smooth stones, their movements practiced from years of repetition. Next door, the potters turned their wheels, shaping the clay brought in from the outskirts of the city. The wheel turned with a gentle rhythm, water dripping occasionally from the potter's hands to keep the clay supple. The jars and bowls, once shaped, were set out in the sun to dry before being fired in wood-fed kilns. When the firing was done, the warm, earthen scent of fresh pottery drifted out into the street. The blacksmith's forges glowed even in daylight. Here, the air was heavier, tinged with the sharp tang of metal and the occasional hiss of steam when hot iron met water. They fashioned hinges, nails, cooking pots, and the long, graceful blades of machetes used in the countryside. Sparks leapt from the anvil as each blow of the hammer found its mark, the sound carrying down the street in slow, regular beats. Apprentices moved between these shops, fetching tools, carrying finished goods, and learning the techniques of their trades. Many were sons of craftsmen, expected to inherit the work of their fathers. Others came from rural villages, seeking the steadier life of the city. For them, the days were long, but the skills they acquired could mean security in a place where much of life was uncertain. The craftsman's quarter was also a place of quiet exchange. A carpenter might trade a repaired chair for a set of new clay mugs. A potter might swap jars for iron hinges. Coins changed hands, but barter still held a place here, especially among those who had known each other for years. By late afternoon, the light slanted through the narrow streets, catching on curls of sawdust and thin trails of smoke rising from the kilns and forges. The craftsmen cleaned their benches, stacked their tools, and covered their work with cloth to keep the dust off. The smells of the quarter shifted as cooking fires were lit for the evening meal, maize dough baking on griddles, stew simmering with herbs, a reminder that these workshops were not just places of labor, but part of a living neighborhood. When night fell, the quarter grew quiet, the only sound the faint creak of shutters in the wind. Yet the work of the day lingered, in the smooth surface of a new table, the even glaze of a water jar, the steady edge of a sharpened blade. These were the unseen foundations of the city's life, as essential in their way as the water carried through its muddy streets. Bogotá, high in its mountain basin, could not survive on its own. Its streets, houses, and plazas depended on the flow of food from the surrounding sabana, a broad, fertile plain ringed by hills. Every day, long before the city's bells marked dawn, that flow began. From villages scattered across the plain, farmers loaded their mules with woven baskets of produce. Potatoes, maize, beans, and squashes were stacked carefully so as not to bruise. Chickens, tied gently by the legs, were carried in pairs. Clay jars held milk still warm from the morning's milking, while bundles of herbs and fresh-cut flowers were wrapped in palm leaves to keep them cool. The journey into the city was slow. The roads were little more than packed dirt, softened by rain and furrowed by wagon wheels. In the dim morning light, the line of travelers looked like a moving thread, mule after mule, each step measured, the sound of hooves mixing with the quiet murmur of conversation. As they neared the city gates, the first vendors from inside were already arriving to meet them. The market itself was not a single place, but several, each with its own character. In the main plaza, under the watch of the cathedral, stalls sold the staples: maize flour, dried beans, salt, and cooking oil. Nearby, a smaller square was devoted to fresh produce, the air there alive with the green scent of vegetables and the sweetness of fruit. On certain days, the meat market opened, its wooden tables stacked with cuts from cattle, pigs, and sheep brought in from estates on the plains. The noise was constant but never frantic. Vendors called out their prices, often in sing-song tones. Buyers bargained gently, offering a few coins less, receiving in return a slightly larger handful. Children wove between the stalls, sometimes carrying small baskets for their parents, sometimes simply watching. Beyond food, the markets also carried goods from further afield. Dried fish from the Magdalena River Valley, cacao from the warmer lands to the south, and even, on rare occasions, spices from across the sea. These traveled along the same routes as the sabana's produce, carried by mule trains that wound their way slowly into the city, guided by men who knew every bend and incline of the mountain paths. For the people of Bogotá, the market was as much a place of connection as of commerce. News traveled here just as in the Plaza Mayor, a whispered account of a poor harvest in one village, a warning about thieves along a certain road, or word of a wedding, a birth, or a death. The goods changed with the seasons. In the rainy months, more root vegetables and dried goods. In the dry months, a greater variety of fresh greens and fruit. By late morning, the market reached its busiest point. The smells mingled, fresh-cut herbs, wood smoke from nearby kitchens, the earthy scent of potatoes, the faint tang of curing meats. The sun, when it broke through the mountain clouds, warmed the backs of those haggling over prices. Then, slowly, the pace began to ease. By early afternoon, many of the baskets stood empty. The farmers, their goods sold, began their slow journey home, mules lighter, pockets heavier by a few coins. By evening, the squares where the markets had stood were swept clean, their stones drying in the cooling air. Yet the city remained full from their work, kitchens stocked, tables set, the rhythm of the Sabana's labor woven quietly into every meal that would be eaten that night. As the last light faded over the Sabana, Bogotá shifted into a slower rhythm. The day's noise, the calls of market vendors, the ring of hammers from the craftsman's quarter, the clatter of mule hooves, softened into scattered sounds that echoed more in the cool evening air. The streets, lit only by oil lanterns, took on a different character. Lamplighters moved through the main thoroughfares, carrying long poles tipped with a small flame. One by one, they touched each iron lantern, coaxing it to life. The glass panes caught the light and glowed softly, casting trembling patterns on the cobblestones. In the narrower lanes, light came from the doorways of homes and workshops, spilling faintly onto the street before being swallowed by shadow. The plazas emptied except for a few lingering figures, perhaps a messenger finishing an errand, or a watchman making his slow circuit with a lantern in hand. The cathedral's bells still marked the hours, but their sound seemed fuller in the night air, rolling through the streets and up to the tiled rooftops. For those seeking company, the taverns were a warm refuge. Behind their heavy wooden doors, the air was scented with wood smoke and fermented drink. Aguardiente, the sharp sugarcane liquor, was poured into clay cups. Benches were filled with muleteers, craftsmen, and the occasional soldier, their voices low but carrying a hum of shared stories and news. Some taverns offered simple meals, stews of beans and pork, bread still warm from the oven, maize cakes browned on griddles. Others served as meeting points for travelers, where plans were made for the next day's journeys. Music, when it came, was unhurried, a soft strumming of a tipal or guitar, the rise and fall of a voice carrying a familiar folk tune. The songs told of the countryside, of love, of journeys along the Magdalena River, of lives both far and near. In the flicker of firelight, faces softened, and the day's work faded into the background. Outside, the streets between taverns and homes were quiet. The night air at this altitude was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke from kitchen hearths. Footsteps echoed, sometimes accompanied by the faint creak of a cartwheel as someone made a late delivery. The watchmen, serenos, moved slowly through their assigned routes, announcing the hour and the weather in steady, practiced calls. Their presence was meant to reassure, though in the deepest parts of the night the streets could feel empty enough to belong entirely to the sound of your own steps. In wealthier households, evenings were passed indoors under candlelight. Letters were read aloud, sewing was done by hand, and quiet conversation unfolded against the steady crackle of a small fire. In more modest homes, the light might be just a single oil lamp, and the night's tasks, mending clothes, grinding maize for the next day's bread, would be finished before turning in. By midnight, Bogotá seemed almost still. A few taverns might still glow dimly, their doors closed to keep out the cold, but most of the city lay in shadow. The trickle of fountains in courtyards, the distant toll of a bell, and the slow breathing of a sleeping city became the only sounds. In this quiet, the water carriers, the craftsmen, the market traders, all the city's unseen lifeblood, rested until the cycle began again with the first pale light over the mountains. High on the plateau of the Sabana, Bogotá's seasons were not marked by snow and thaw, but by the ebb and flow of rain and sun. These changes, subtle yet steady, shaped the rhythm of the city just as much as its bells, markets, and plazas. In the rainy months, clouds rolled over the mountains like slow ships, their undersides heavy with moisture. Mornings began with mist so thick that rooftops disappeared into whiteness, and the cobblestones glistened even before the first drops fell. Rain could arrive in sudden bursts or as long, steady drizzles that lasted for hours. Streets turned slick, puddles spread in uneven hollows, and the sound of water filled every corner, dripping from eaves, trickling into the open drains, pattering on the leaves in courtyard gardens. The water carriers worked in these months with an extra challenge. Their loads grew heavier in the damp air, and the muddy streets slowed the mules' pace. Yet the city seemed to fold into itself during the rains, its life turned inward, shop shutters drawn closer, conversations held under awnings, the warmth of kitchens and taverns more welcome than ever. When the dry season came, the change was almost immediate. The sky deepened into a high, clay blue, and the sunlight, though mild compared to the lowlands, cast sharper shadows on the whitewashed walls. The air felt lighter, and the streets, though still dusty in places, were easier to cross. The market stalls brimmed with fresh produce from the countryside, as travel along the roads became quicker. The sound of hammers, saws, and wheels seemed to carry farther in the dry air, and the plazas filled with more people lingering in the open. The cycles of rain and sun shaped the work of every person in Bogotá. Farmers timed their planting and harvesting to these patterns. Builders planned major works for the dry months, when materials could be transported without the delays of flooded roads. Even the convent gardens mirrored the changes, their flowers blooming in bursts after the first rains, then fading quietly under the steady dry season light. And yet, for all the differences, the city's core rhythm endured. The bells still marked the hours, the water still had to be carried, the bread still baked each morning. The rains might slow the streets, the sun might quicken them, but Bogotá's pulse, slow, steady, and deliberate, never faltered. And so, we leave Colonial Bogotá as night settles once more over the sabana. The mules are at rest, the markets empty, and the streets quiet but for the slow steps of a watchman passing under a flickering lantern. We have walked with the water carriers through mud and mist, stood in the plaza where voices and goods mingle, stepped into the shaded courtyards of the wealthy, and listened to the soft echo of chants inside a convent. We have followed the paths of gold offerings into still waters, and traced the seasons as they shaped the city's life. Bogotá, in these centuries past, was a place of contrasts, refinement and labor, faith and trade, stillness and movement. Every task, no matter how small or unseen, fed into the slow turning of its days. And though the city has changed, the echo of those rhythms remains, if you know how to listen. As you rest now, imagine the distant toll of a bell in the mountain air, the faint trickle of a courtyard fountain, the cool touch of stone underfoot. Let the city drift into stillness, as the past settles gently into the quiet of the night. Settle yourself in, perhaps with a blanket draped lightly across your legs, and allow your thoughts to drift away from the present moment. Tonight, we are going to travel back to a part of the world where the horizon stretches farther than the eye can follow, and the land seems to breathe in slow, sweeping motions. The Orinoco Plains, vast, sun-bleached, and endlessly open, were home to a people whose lives were bound to the rhythm of the seasons, the will of their herds, and the moods of the river itself. These were the Llaneros, the cowboys of the Venezuelan and Colombian plains. They lived on horseback, carried the scent of grass and leather on their clothing, and knew how to read the sky with the same ease you might read a clock. But their world was no romantic painting. It was a place of long days that bled into long nights, a life spent fighting fatigue, biting insects, unpredictable floods, and the weight of solitude. Tonight, we will step quietly into their camps, and then, as our journey continues, we'll meet a general who rose from their ranks to change the course of independence. We'll hear of whispers surrounding a shipwreck somewhere along the Orinoco, and finally, drift into the salons of early Republican Bogotá, where a very different kind of life unfolded. For now, let your thoughts slow to the pace of a river current. Imagine the vast openness of a land where the wind is never still, and where men and women lived in a rhythm that was both beautiful and unrelenting. Let us begin. The Llanero's day began before the sun had broken the horizon. The cool air of the pre-dawn was, for a short while, almost pleasant. It carried the faint fragrance of dew settling on tough, wiry grasses, and the distant calls of birds beginning to stir in the marshes. The men would rise from hammocks slung between posts or trees, stretch stiff muscles, and prepare themselves for the long hours ahead. Coffee, strong and bitter, was passed around in tin mugs, often alongside a simple breakfast of arpa or dried meat. And then, the work began. A Llanero's life revolved around the cattle, thousands of them, spread across a landscape that had no fences, no neat enclosures. Driving them meant days, sometimes weeks, of riding through open plains, crossing rivers that could swell without warning, and guiding the herds through patches of land where the ground was more mud than earth. The mosquitoes were a constant presence. In the marshlands, they would rise in dense clouds, their high-pitched hum like an unending note. They bit through thin cotton shirts, found their way into ears and under collars, leaving behind raised welts that never had time to heal before the next bite came. The Llaneros had remedies, smearing themselves with animal fat, burning green wood to create thick smoke, but nothing truly kept the insects away. Rain was both friend and enemy. It turned the plains green and watered the cattle, but it also brought floods. The Orinoco and its tributaries could spill over with startling speed, swallowing fields, camps, and even entire herds. A Llanero might go to sleep under a clear, starry sky and wake to find his camp surrounded by water, the hammock swaying just above the surface. In those moments, all work paused. Until the waters receded, there was nothing to do but wait and keep the horses and cattle from wandering too far. The heat, when it came, was heavy and unrelenting. There were no tall trees to cast broad shade, only the occasional cluster of palms, their fronds rattling in the wind. The horses moved with heads low, their flanks slick with sweat. The men wore wide-brimmed hats, but even those could not keep the sun from pressing down like a weight on their backs. By midday, the horizon shimmered with heat, and the air grew still, except for the lowing of cattle and the creak of saddle leather. Meals on the trail were spare. Beef was eaten fresh when an animal was slaughtered, roasted over an open fire until the outside was crisp and the inside still tender. At other times, the men relied on tasajo, thin strips of beef salted and dried in the sun, which could be carried for days without spoiling. There was no guarantee of variety. A Llanero might eat beef for breakfast, beef for lunch, and beef again for supper, sometimes without even the comfort of a cup of coffee if supplies were low. Nights in the plains could be unexpectedly cool, the wind rising as the sun sank. The sky became a vast dome, pricked with stars so clear and numerous they seemed close enough to touch. In the distance, one could hear the calls of night birds, the splash of fish in the rivers, and occasionally, the low growl of a jaguar far from camp. But peace was not always restful. There were still cattle to watch, horses to tether, and fires to tend. The work of the Llanero did not end when the sun went down, it merely shifted into another kind of vigilance. And yet, despite the hardship, there was pride. A Llanero's skill with a horse was unmatched. From boyhood, they learned to ride without stirrups, to control their mounts with the lightest touch of a rein, to use the long lance in herding and in defense. In their own way, they commanded the plains, moving in concert with a land that could not be tamed, only respected. Still, it was not an easy life, nor one that offered much rest. Every day brought a test, of strength, of endurance, of patience. And in the quiet moments, when the cattle were calm and the sky was streaked with the last light of day, a Llanero might pause, listening to the sighing of the wind over the grass, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same endless cycle again. The Orinoco River. A slow-moving expanse in some places, a restless, churning force in others. Its course winds through forests, skirts the edges of wide plains, and threads between banks that shift with every rainy season. It has been a lifeline for countless generations, carrying fish, fresh water, and the goods of trade, but it has also been a keeper of secrets. Among those secrets is a story that has been told in hushed voices along its banks for centuries, the tale of a Spanish treasure ship that never reached its destination. The story has many versions. In one telling, it begins in the waning years of the colonial period, when Spanish galleons still moved between the New World and Europe, heavy with gold, silver, and precious goods extracted from the continent. This particular ship, so the story goes, had come inland, navigating up the Orinoco in the hopes of delivering its cargo safely to a fortified port, away from the eyes of pirates. In another version, the ship was not a grand galleon at all, but a smaller, swift-moving vessel, carrying payroll for Spanish soldiers and officials stationed deep in the interior. Either way, the heart of the story remains the same. Somewhere along the river's length, disaster struck. The Orinoco is not an easy river to master. Its channels are deceptive, sometimes splitting without warning into narrow streams before widening again into broad, open waters. There are sandbanks where none were the year before, submerged logs carried from distant floods, and sudden changes in current that can pull even an experienced pilot off course. The legend says that in one such place, perhaps during a season of high water, the ship met its end. Some say it struck a hidden rock, others that a sudden storm rose, bringing with it fierce winds and sheets of rain that blinded the crew. Whatever the cause, the vessel was lost, vanishing beneath the brown waters, its cargo settling into the riverbed. No confirmed wreck has ever been found, though there are accounts from fishermen and travelers who claim to have seen strange shapes beneath the surface, outlines of timbers, the faint glint of something metallic in the shifting light. In the dry season, when the river falls, some speak of odd pieces of workwood protruding from the mud, only to disappear again when the rains return. Archaeologists have occasionally taken an interest in these stories, though the Orinoco's vastness makes any focused search difficult. Its shifting sediments bury and reveal in cycles, erasing clear evidence almost as soon as it appears. And in truth, the line between history and local lore is thin here. Tales of treasure are as much a part of riverside culture as the fishing nets and hammocks strung between palm trees. There are even whispers of those who tried to find the wreck for themselves. In one often repeated account, a small group set out in dugout canoes during an unusually low river season. They returned days later, silent and withdrawn, speaking little of what they had seen, but never attempting the journey again. Whether they encountered danger, wild animals, illness, or the river's own unpredictable moods, no one could say for certain. The idea of treasure lying somewhere in the Orinoco's depths has a quiet allure. It's not just the thought of gold or silver, though that is tempting enough. It's the image of a forgotten moment, frozen in time, the ship's wooden beams darkened by water, the cargo hold filled with objects meant for a world that never received them. And perhaps part of the legend's endurance lies in the fact that the Orinoco itself feels timeless. The same waters that might have swallowed a Spanish vessel still roll past the same bends, under the same sky, carrying with them the stories of all they have seen. Whether or not the treasure ship ever truly existed, the mystery remains, folded into the slow, ceaseless rhythm of the river. From here, our path will take us far from the marshes and winding channels, up into the cool air of Bogotá, where life in the early republic unfolded in salons and parlors, in conversations over tea, and in the clinking of porcelain cups. Rising nearly 2,600 meters above sea level, Bogotá was, and still is, a city of cool mornings and thin, crisp air. In the early Republican period, the decades following independence, it was a place that, for its upper classes, moved at a measured, deliberate pace. Here, the dust of the plains and the constant motion of the Llaneros felt far away. The homes of the elite stood along cobbled streets, their whitewashed walls and heavy wooden doors concealing quiet inner courtyards. These patios were often shaded by orange or guava trees, with stone fountains that murmured softly through the afternoon. Servants moved about silently, sweeping fallen leaves, tending flowerbeds, or bringing trays of coffee to their employers. The day's social life often began late in the morning. After a leisurely breakfast, perhaps bread, fresh cheese, and chocolate thick with cinnamon, well-dressed ladies might gather in drawing rooms furnished with carved chairs and imported fabrics. Here, they would exchange the latest gossip, not just about family and acquaintances, but about politics, always a lively topic in a young republic still finding its balance. Tea gatherings became a favored pastime among the wealthy, a custom inspired by European fashions. Porcelain cups, some imported from France or England, were set carefully upon polished tables. Alongside the tea, there might be small pastries, candied fruits, or delicate empanadas. Conversations flowed gently, mixing personal matters with news from the capital's political salons. Fashion itself was a statement of position. Men wore tailored coats, waistcoats, and cravats in the European style, though the fabrics were sometimes lighter to suit the Andean climate. Women dressed in fine dresses, silks and satins in muted tones during the day, with more elaborate embroidery for evening visits. Imported accessories, such as lace shawls or Parisian hats, were quietly displayed, signaling a family's wealth and connections. The evenings in Bogotá's elite circles often involved small gatherings rather than grand public events. Musicians might be invited to play in the corner of a salon, their violins and guitars providing a soft backdrop to conversation. Guests lingered over wine or hot chocolate, discussing the latest pamphlets or debating the ideas of political figures like Bolívar and Santander. For the upper class, life was carefully managed to maintain both appearances and influence. Family alliances were strengthened through marriages arranged as much for social advantage as for personal affection. Owning property in the countryside provided income, while a home in the city ensured visibility in social and political matters. It was a world where words carried weight. A subtle remark, offered over tea, could shift an alliance. A whispered confidence could travel from one sitting room to another by nightfall. Politics seeped into drawing rooms as naturally as the scent of brewing coffee. And yet, even in these refined spaces, the memory of the independence wars lingered. Some guests had fought in them, or lost relatives to the struggle. Portraits of military leaders hung alongside religious images in many homes, reminders of the cost of the new republic. The contrast with life on the Orinoco plains could not have been sharper. Where the Llanero endured rain, heat, and endless rides under an open sky, the Bogotano aristocrat navigated a world of ritual, conversation, and careful presentation. One life demanded physical endurance, the other required social skill and political awareness. Both, in their own way, were battles of survival. One fought against the elements, the other against the subtle currents of influence and power. As night fell over Bogotá, the streets quieted. Oil lamps glowed softly behind shuttered windows, and the cold air carried the faint echo of hoofbeats from a lone rider making his way home. Within the walls of the city's finest houses, the last guests of the evening took their leave, stepping into the crisp darkness. And inside, the servants cleared away the tea sets, the conversations fading into memory until the next gathering. The Orinoco plains, with their boundless horizons and restless skies, have a way of shaping those who live upon them. We began our journey among the Llaneros, riders who rose with the sun, whose lives were measured in long days of cattle drives, the hum of insects, and the steady creak of saddle leather. It was a life of endurance, each day demanding strength, patience, and the quiet acceptance that tomorrow would bring the same trials again. From that world emerged figures like José Antonio Páez, men forged in hardship, their skill and resolve carried from the open plains into the heat of battle, and later, into the careful maneuvers of political life. His story bridged the raw and the refined, the dust of the grasslands and the polished floors of presidential halls. We drifted then into the waters of the Orinoco, following the uncertain trail of a Spanish treasure ship whose fate remains hidden beneath layers of silt and shifting current. Whether fact or fable, such stories remind us that rivers are more than lines on a map, they are keepers of memory, flowing past the same bends for centuries, carrying secrets known only to themselves. And finally, we climbed to the high plateau of Bogotá, stepping into the cool courtyards and refined salons of the Republic's aristocracy. Here, lives were guided not by the rise and fall of the river, but by the slow turning of conversations, the arrangement of marriages, and the subtle influence of whispered words over tea. 4 worlds, each distinct, each with its own demands. From the muddy marshes of the plains to the candlelit parlors of the capital, the early 19th century in this region was a mosaic of contrasts. And yet, beneath it all, ran the same undercurrent of adaptation, whether to the elements, to shifting politics, to the uncertainty of fortune, or to the intricate choreography of social life. Now, as you rest, perhaps you can picture the silhouettes of horsemen against a setting sun, the soft gleam of a porcelain cup in a Bogotá drawing room, the wide, patient sweep of the Orinoco. These moments, separated by distance and circumstance, are still threads in the same tapestry. The plains grow quiet at night. The river flows on, unhurried. And in the city, the last lamps are extinguished. History settles into the hush of evening, waiting for morning to bring its stories to life once more. Tonight, I invite you to drift back in time to the sun-washed shores of the Caribbean, to a place where the air was heavy with the scent of salt, tar, and tropical heat. This is the port of Cartagena de Indias during the height of the Spanish colonial era, a city both beautiful and unforgiving. Here, the stone ramparts glowed pale in the morning light, their cannons pointing toward a shimmering horizon. The harbor was alive with motion, the creak of wooden masts swaying gently in the tide, the rhythmic splash of oars, and the muffled voices of sailors speaking in a dozen accents from across the empire. Above it all, gulls wheeled lazily, their calls echoing over the water. But behind the postcard image of whitewashed buildings and glittering seas lay a harsher reality, one lived by the dock workers, the men who hauled, sweated, and strained beneath the punishing tropical sun. They were the lifeblood of the port, their backs bearing the weight of the Spanish crown's ambitions. In this story, we will wander their world, step into their labor, and sense the daily demands of a city built on both trade and toil. As the night deepens, we will move from their weary footsteps to the grand history surrounding them, the thunder of cannons during the Great Siege, the whispered legends of a sunken galleon laden with gold, and the quiet elegance inside the quarters of a Spanish admiral. But first, let us begin where every ship in Cartagena's harbor began and ended its journey, along the busy, sun-baked docks. Imagine the first light of dawn breaking over Cartagena's bay. The sky is a pale wash of coral and gold, and the water reflects it like rippled glass. The air is already warm, a heavy warmth that will grow steadily into the punishing midday heat. Along the edge of the harbor, the stone quays stretch out in a jagged line, crowded with barrels, crates, and bundles of hemp rope coiled like sleeping serpents. The dock workers begin to gather. Some are free men, others are enslaved, many are of African descent, their skin glistening with early sweat. A few are indigenous, pressed into service after journeys from distant villages. Others are Spanish or mixed heritage locals, accustomed to the sea's moods but not spared its hardships. The air hums with the sounds of their voices, deep laughter, muttered complaints, the gruff orders of overseers. Work starts quickly. A galleon has anchored in the harbor, its sails furled after months at sea. The ship smells of brine, damp wood, and the faint sourness of men confined for too long in close quarters. Dock workers trudge up and down the gangplank, carrying sacks of cocoa, barrels of wine, crates of dried meat, and bundles of cured hides. Each load digs into shoulders already sore from the previous day's labor. The sun climbs higher. Within an hour, shirts are soaked through. The fabric clings to skin, sweat stings the eyes. Many of the workers wear wide-brimmed hats woven from palm leaves, but the brims are frayed, the shade minimal. Sunburn is constant here, not the mild pink of a northern summer, but the deep, cracked burn of months under the equatorial glare. Lips chap and split, the skin on the neck and arms peels in thin sheets. Still, the work continues. Underfoot, the docks are alive with motion. Ship rats, fat from grain and spoiled cargo, dart between gaps in the planks. Cats prowl among the barrels, their tails flicking lazily, unhurried by the scurrying of their prey. Occasionally, a worker will pause to stamp a foot, chasing a rat away from the day's provisions. Overseers pace the length of the quay, their voices sharp. They must keep the cargo flowing, sugar bound for Seville, indigo for Cadiz, silver from the mines of Peru headed for the royal treasury. Every delay costs money, and the rhythm of the port is relentless. A worker's back may ache, his legs tremble from the weight, but there is no slowing the tide of goods. The smells shift with each load. The earthy sweetness of cocoa powder clings to the air, only to be replaced by the sharp tang of citrus from barrels of limes. Then comes the musk of animal hides, the resin scent of freshly cut timber, the almost floral note of tobacco leaves bundled in burlap. Each scent is a reminder of the vast trade web that Cartagena connects, a web that stretches from the Andes to the Philippines. Water is precious. A clay jug is passed between men, the water lukewarm and tasting faintly of the pot it has been stored in. They drink sparingly, knowing the overseer's patience has limits. For some, there will be salted fish and cassava bread later. For others, a quick handful of maize before the next ship docks. By mid-afternoon, the heat is at its peak. The stones of the quay radiate warmth upward, and even the gulls seek shade on the masts. Yet the work goes on. Galleons departing for Europe must be loaded before the tide turns, and incoming vessels must be cleared before their cargo spoils. It is a dance of urgency beneath an unyielding sky. As the day begins to fade, the light softens, turning the harbor gold again. Workers' shoulders sag, their movements slower, but the work is not yet done. The last crates are stacked, the last ropes coiled neatly beside the bollards. The overseer's shouts are fewer now, replaced by the clink of coins handed to those who are paid in wages, meager coins, often spent that same night on food, rum, or a place to rest. And then, as the harbor quiets, the city's other life awakens, the narrow streets of Cartagena filling with evening music, the air cooling just enough to carry the scent of grilled fish and fresh bread from the market. The dock workers disappear into its shadows, their work hidden again until the next dawn. This, day after day, was the rhythm of their lives, the strain of heavy loads, the glare of the sun, the skitter of ship rats, and the slow satisfaction of work done, not for glory, but for survival. The year was 1741, and the quiet rhythm of Cartagena's harbor was about to be shattered. In the early months of that year, word began to trickle through the city, rumors of a massive British fleet sailing toward the Spanish Main. Some whispered of hundreds of ships, others of thousands of men, their sails crowding the horizon like a moving forest. For a city accustomed to the ebb and flow of trade, the idea of such an armada stirred an unease that even the midday heat could not match. Cartagena de Indias was no ordinary port. It was one of the most heavily fortified cities in the Americas, its defenses built over decades in response to pirate raids and rival empires. Towering stone walls encircled the old city, massive forts guarded its approaches. The most imposing of these was the Castillo San Felipe de Barajas, a fortress that seemed to grow out of the rocky hill beneath it, its angles and bastions designed to repel the most determined of attacks. Still, the threat was unlike anything the city had faced before. The British expedition, commanded by Admiral Edward Vernon, was set to include over 180 ships and more than 20,000 men, among them soldiers, sailors, and colonial militias from as far away as North America. Their goal was clear: to seize Cartagena and deal a crippling blow to Spanish power in the Caribbean. When the first sails appeared on the horizon, the sight was both awe-inspiring and ominous. From the ramparts, defenders could see them, a line of masts, tall and unbroken, stretching across the sea. The air was heavy with the distant thud of drums and the snap of canvas in the wind. Inside the city, bells rang to signal the alarm. Dock work ceased, the port that normally bustled with trade now prepared for war. The defense of the city fell largely to Blas de Lezo, a one-eyed, one-armed Spanish admiral whose remaining leg was crippled from earlier battles. He was a man of quiet resolve, moving slowly through the fortifications, speaking calmly to the troops. His presence steadied them, for he had faced the British before and lived to tell the tale. The siege began with bombardment. British cannons opened fire from the sea, their deep thunder rolling over the water and echoing against the city's stone walls. Dust and fragments of masonry rained down, but the walls held. By night, the city's defenders moved quietly through the shadows, repairing damage, shifting cannon, and strengthening barricades. The tropical climate became an ally to the Spanish. The rains came, turning the ground to mud. Mosquitoes swarmed in the humid air, carrying disease that began to spread through the British camp. Water grew foul, rations spoiled. For the attackers, the heat was unrelenting by day, the damp clinging and oppressive by night. Blas de Lezo used every advantage. When the British attempted to land troops, they were met by fierce resistance and the cunning use of the city's terrain. Channels were blocked, shallows were fortified, and the harbor's narrow entrances turned into traps. Small Spanish boats darted between the larger enemy ships, harassing them under cover of night. The Castillo San Felipe became the heart of the defense. From its walls, the defenders repelled wave after wave of assaults. The stone bastions absorbed the blows of British artillery, and the fort's elevated position allowed the Spanish gunners to fire down with devastating accuracy. Days stretched into weeks. The sounds of battle became a constant background, the crack of muskets, the boom of cannon, the distant cries carried by the wind. But the British strength began to falter. Disease and exhaustion thinned their ranks. Supplies ran low. The sheer difficulty of sustaining such a large force in hostile territory became clear. In the end, after more than 2 months of siege, the mighty British Armada withdrew. When the last of their sails vanished beyond the horizon, Cartagena breathed again. The city had endured one of the largest naval attacks in the history of the Americas and had emerged battered but unbroken. The walls still stood, the harbor was once again calm. Life slowly returned to its familiar rhythms. The docks resumed their labor, ships once more carried goods rather than soldiers. But the memory of that siege lingered, a reminder of the city's resilience and of the quiet, steadfast leadership of Admiral Blas de Lezo. And, in the evenings, when the heat had softened and the streets glowed with the light of oil lamps, older residents would tell the story to younger ears, of the time when the British came with all their power, and Cartagena sent them home again. The mystery of the San Jose galleon, a legendary treasure lost beneath the waves. Long before the siege, before the British sails darkened the horizon, there was another story tied to Cartagena's name, one of wealth beyond imagining, and of a ship whose fate still whispers through the deep waters of the Caribbean. The San Jose was no ordinary galleon. Launched in the late 17th century, she was part of the Spanish treasure fleet, the lifeline between the riches of the New World and the coffers of the Spanish crown. Each year, these fleets carried silver from the mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia, gold from Colombia, emeralds from Muzo, and a host of other valuable goods. The San Jose, with her 3 towering masts and heavy guns, was a jewel of this fleet. In June 1708, the ship lay anchored in Cartagena's harbor, preparing for the dangerous journey back to Spain. Her cargo was staggering, by some accounts, over 200 tons of gold, silver, and precious stones. It was a fortune so vast that it could change the balance of power in Europe. But such treasure could not remain a secret for long. Lurking off the coast were ships of Britain's Royal Navy. At the time, Spain and Britain were embroiled in the War of the Spanish Succession, and treasure fleets were prime targets. Commanded by Commodore Charles Wager, the British had been lying in wait, hoping to intercept the fleet before it could escape into the open Atlantic. On the evening of June 8, as the sun dipped low and the Caribbean waters turned to molten gold, the Spanish fleet set sail from Cartagena. The San Jose, heavily laden and slower than some of her escorts, was soon in the sights of the British. The two sides met off the Baru Peninsula, the warm tropical breeze carrying the distant thunder of cannon. What happened next remains a point of both record and mystery. According to accounts, the San Jose fought fiercely. Her gunners returned volley after volley, the smoke from her cannon drifting across the water in thick, acrid clouds. But then, in the chaos of battle, disaster struck. The San Jose exploded. Some say it was a lucky British shot that ignited her powder magazine. Others claim it was an accident aboard the ship. Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic. In a single moment, the great galleon and nearly all of her crew vanished beneath the waves, taking her treasure with them. The sea boiled with fire and debris before swallowing it all into the depths. For over 3 centuries, the exact resting place of the San Jose remained unknown. Stories passed through generations in Cartagena, of fishermen who saw strange shapes on the seabed, of divers who glimpsed glints of gold far below. Expeditions were mounted, some official, others little more than hopeful ventures. The waters off Cartagena are treacherous for treasure seekers, with shifting sands, strong currents, and the deep, silty cover that hides wrecks from view. In recent years, technology has brought the San Jose back into the realm of possibility. Sonar scans and remotely operated vehicles have mapped the seabed in unprecedented detail. Images have emerged of cannons encrusted with coral, of ceramics lying undisturbed in the darkness, of timbers that have rested on the ocean floor since that fateful night. The Colombian government, Spain, and private companies have all laid claim to the wreck, each citing history, heritage, or the staggering value of what lies within. And so, the San Jose remains, not in a museum, but in the cool, silent depths of the Caribbean. The water there is timeless. The sunlight filters down in slow-moving shafts, barely touching the sand where the ship rests. Barnacles cling to her remnants, fish weave between the shadows of her ribs. The gold, if it is still there, lies in darkness, untouched for over 300 years. In Cartagena, the legend persists. 4 dock workers unloading cargo in the sweltering sun, 4 sailors leaning on the rail of their ships, 4 children listening to the old men at the quayside. The San Jose is not just a wreck, it is a reminder of the fortunes and dangers that have always moved through these waters. A story of glory and loss, as much a part of the city's history as its walls and fortresses. And perhaps that is fitting. For in Cartagena, the sea gives, and the sea takes, and sometimes, it keeps its secrets for lifetimes. If the docks of Cartagena were a world of sweat and splinters, and the siege walls a world of powder and grit, then the quarters of a Spanish admiral were something else entirely, a carefully curated space where the power of the crown was expressed not in cannon fire, but in polished wood, fine textiles, and the quiet authority of command. Imagine stepping aboard a well-appointed flagship anchored in the harbor. The deck is bustling with activity, sailors coiling ropes, carpenters repairing planks, midshipmen hurrying about with messages. But as you approach the stern, the sounds of labor fade into a calmer rhythm. Here, a set of heavy doors, polished smooth by countless hands, leads into the admiral's private domain. The air inside is different, cooler, scented faintly of beeswax and the tang of the sea that still slips in through the open windows. Light filters through panes of thick, greenish glass, casting gentle patterns on the floorboards. The space is modest in size by land-based standards, but for a ship it is generous, a combination of office, dining room, and sleeping quarters, all fitted within the curved walls of the stern. At the far end, a broad table stands beneath a map of the Caribbean, its parchment edges curling slightly in the humidity. Here the admiral studies charts marked with tiny, careful script, noting shoals, enemy patrol routes, and the safest harbors in a storm. A set of dividers rests beside him, along with a compass whose brass has been polished to a soft glow. Beside the maps, sealed letters bearing the royal seal await his attention, their wax unbroken, the contents intended for his eyes alone. The furniture is functional, but it speaks of privilege compared to the bare hammocks of the crew. A bed with a frame of dark mahogany sits against the wall, its mattress stuffed with clean linen. The sheets, though plain, are fresh and regularly laundered, a luxury in a world where salt air quickly wears through fabric. Curtains can be drawn across the bed for privacy, shutting out both light and the gentle rocking of the ship. Along one wall, a small cabinet holds items from across the empire, a porcelain cup from Manila, a silver goblet from Peru, a carved ivory letter opener from Africa. These objects are not merely decorations, they are tokens of a world-spanning network, reminders of the admiral's reach and responsibility. Meals here are taken with more ceremony than on deck. While the crew might eat salted meat and hardtack, the admiral's table might feature preserved fruits, fresh bread brought aboard from shore, wine carefully stored in dark bottles, and perhaps a joint of meat roasted in the galley and served on pewter plates. A steward stands by to pour and to clear, moving silently across the polished boards. Yet even in this relative comfort, the life of an admiral is never entirely free of strain. The windows open to the sea, and with them comes the constant reminder of its moods, the distant roll of waves, the occasional slap of spray against the hull. At night, the admiral might lie awake listening to the creak of the timbers, the muted shouts of the watch on deck, and the knowledge that every decision he makes can ripple through the fate of hundreds of men and the course of the empire's fortunes. Here, in this private space, the weight of command is balanced by the quiet rituals of daily life. A lamp is lit at dusk, casting a warm circle over the charts. The admiral writes in his log, the scratching of the quill a steady counterpoint to the muffled life of the ship beyond the door. He may take a final walk on deck before retiring, looking out over the anchored vessels in the harbor, the city walls lit with lanterns, the humid air carrying the mingled scents of salt water and distant cooking fires. In the morning, the cycle begins again. The steward brings a basin of water for washing. The admiral dresses in crisp linen and a dark blue coat edged with gold braid. Boots are polished, a ceremonial sword rests within easy reach. Soon he will step outside, and the crew will see not a man in his private quarters, but the embodiment of royal authority, the voice that commands the guns, charts the course, and represents Spain's will in these far-flung waters. And yet, behind those heavy doors, the quarters remain as they were, a small sanctuary afloat, part office, part home, part throne room, bound always to the roll and rhythm of the sea. Step away from the stone quays of Cartagena, where the smell of salt and tar lingers in the air, and take a slow walk inland. The noise of the harbor, the shouting stevedores, the gulls, the splash of oars, begins to fade, replaced by the more measured hum of the merchant quarter. Here, the streets are narrower, shaded by balconies draped in flowering bougainvillea. The sun still presses down, but the high walls of the buildings give brief, welcome relief. This was the heart of Cartagena's commercial world. Along these cobbled lanes, traders from Spain, the Americas, and beyond met to exchange goods, news, and deals sealed with a handshake or a quick signature. The buildings here are 2 and 3 stories high, with thick stucco walls painted in warm shades of ochre, cream, and faded blue. On the ground floor, heavy wooden doors open onto dim, cool interiors stacked with goods. Upstairs, the merchants' families live above their livelihood, the rooms catching whatever sea breeze makes it through the latticed shutters. The smell in the merchant quarter is different from the docks, a mingling of spices, cured leather, beeswax, and the faint sweetness of dried fruit. You might pass an open doorway and see bolts of dyed cloth hanging from pegs, their colors vivid in the half-light, deep indigo, bright crimson, sun-bleached gold. In another, barrels of molasses are stacked in neat rows, their sticky scent wafting into the street. Conversations here are quieter but more deliberate. 2 men stand in the shade of a doorway, leaning close over a ledger, their voices low as they tally numbers. A young apprentice hurries past with a basket of papers, bound together with twine. Inside a shop, a clerk carefully weighs a pouch of cinnamon on a brass scale, adjusting the small weights until the balance is just right. The rhythms are precise, practiced, a counterpoint to the physical labor outside. Many of these merchants had far-reaching networks. A deal struck here in Cartagena might involve goods from Mexico, investments from Seville, and customers in Lima or Havana. Letters from across the empire arrived on ships and were read in the shaded interiors of these houses, the wax seals broken with a small knife and the paper unfolded with care. Some letters carried news of prices and harvests, others brought word of relatives half a world away. In the late afternoon, when the heat reached its peak, shutters closed against the sun, and the streets grew quieter. Merchants took their meal in the cool interior rooms, perhaps stewed meat with maize bread, or fresh fish if it had come in from the morning catch. Servants moved quietly through the rooms, carrying pitchers of water or small bowls of fruit. Outside, the street dogs lay in the narrow strips of shade, and the sound of a distant church bell drifted over the rooftops. As the day cooled toward evening, the merchant quarter came alive again. Lanterns were lit, the smell of baking bread from small street ovens filled the air. A few traders stepped out onto their balconies, leaning on the rail to watch the life below. Children played in the street, their laughter echoing softly between the walls. The voices of sailors and dock workers could be heard again as they made their way from the port to the taverns tucked into the side streets. This was not the noisy chaos of the docks, but the steady, deliberate heartbeat of Cartagena's economy. The goods that passed through these hands would travel across oceans. The coin counted here could determine whether a voyage was made, a debt settled, or a fortune lost. And yet, for all its importance, the merchant quarter remained grounded in simple routines, opening the shop at first light, closing the shutters against the midday glare, keeping careful accounts, and waiting for the next ship to bring fresh opportunity. It was a place where wealth flowed quietly, in the cool shade, while only a few streets away, the labor that made it possible toiled beneath the open, burning sky. When the sun finally sank behind the walls of Cartagena, the city exhaled. The glare of the day softened into the gold and violet of twilight, and the heat, though still present, became bearable. Oil lamps flickered to life in the narrow streets, their warm glow pooling on the cobblestones. Somewhere, a guitar began to play, its soft, deliberate strumming drifting over the rooftops. For dock workers, sailors, and soldiers alike, this was the time to seek out the taverns. These were not grand establishments, but small rooms with low ceilings, rough tables, and the constant hum of conversation. The smell inside was a mixture of strong rum, roasted meat, and the salty tang of sweat carried in from the harbor. The floor might be uneven stone, the walls decorated with faded prints of distant ports, or a saint's image framed in wooden candlelight. Here, the divisions of the day blurred. Men who had shouted orders at each other on the quays now sat side by side over mugs of drink. Sailors spoke of weather and tides, merchants spoke of prices and cargo. Foreign tongues mixed with Spanish, creating a low, steady murmur beneath the occasional burst of laughter. A traveler could hear Portuguese from Brazil, French from Saint-Domingue, even the clipped English of Jamaica. The drinks were strong and simple, rum, aguardiente, and wine brought in casks from Spain. The food was hearty, grilled fish, stews thick with beans, bread baked in small clay ovens. Some taverns served fried plantains dusted with salt, or slices of cheese from the inland farms. The meals were not lavish, but after a day under the sun or at sea, they were enough to restore strength. Beyond the taverns, the city's courtyards offered a different kind of evening life. Cartagena's houses were built inward, with open patios at their center, shaded by palms or small citrus trees. At night, families gathered there to eat, talk, and cool themselves in the open air. A clay water jar might be placed in the corner, its surface beading with condensation. Nearby, a small brazier glowed faintly, its embers used to warm food or light pipes. From these courtyards, the sounds of the city were gentle, the distant call of a street vendor selling late-night snacks, the faint rhythm of drums from the Afro-Caribbean neighborhoods beyond the walls, the murmur of conversation carrying just enough to remind one that the city was alive around them. For some, the evening meant games, dice tossed onto a wooden table, or a board for checkers or cards. For others, it meant quiet reflection. Letters were read aloud in the glow of a lantern. Stories were told of voyages past, of storms weathered and fortunes won or lost. The pace was slower now, the urgency of the day replaced with the ease of unhurried talk. Occasionally, a night would be broken by a ship's arrival. The sound of oars in the dark, the call of the watchman on the walls, the thud of a cannon fired in salute, these could send people to the waterfront, lanterns in hand, to see what new cargo or passengers had arrived under the cover of night. But most evenings ended quietly. The tavern doors closed, the lamps were extinguished, and the city settled into the deep hum of sleep. The scent of cooling stone filled the air, mixed with the faint brine carried on the night breeze. For those rising before dawn to return to the docks, these hours of rest were brief, but they were enough to remind them that even in a port built on labor and trade, there was still time to share a drink, a story, and a breath of cool air before the next day began. The first light of morning in Cartagena was often accompanied by sound, not from the docks or the cries of street vendors, but from the deep, resonant tolling of church bells. Their tones carried across the city's tiled rooftops and stone ramparts, calling the faithful to prayer. In a port city as diverse as Cartagena, religion was both a unifying rhythm and a constant presence woven into daily life. The skyline was marked by the domes and towers of churches and convents, their stucco walls gleaming pale in the morning sun. The grandest among them was the Cathedral of Santa Catalina de Alejandría, its facade a blend of Spanish Baroque and Caribbean warmth. Its bells were the city's heartbeat, announcing mass, summoning processions, and marking the hours for those at sea and on land alike. Inside, the air was cool and dim, a respite from the growing heat outside. Light streamed through high windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the beams. The scent of incense lingered in the air, mingling with the faint waxy smell of the tall candles that lined the altar. Wooden pews creaked softly under the weight of parishioners, merchants in fine coats, dock workers in plain shirts, soldiers in uniform, and women in shawls, their faces lit by the flicker of candlelight. The Mass was solemn, its Latin prayers rolling gently from the priest's lips. The organ's low tones resonated through the stone, and the measured cadence of the liturgy seemed to slow the very air. For many, it was a pause in an otherwise busy day, a moment to sit in stillness before returning to the demands of work or trade. Religious life in Cartagena extended beyond the church walls. Feast days were marked with processions that wound through the city's narrow streets. On such days, the sound of drums and hymns would announce the approach of a long column of people, priests carrying gilded crosses, acolytes swinging censers that trailed ribbons of fragrant smoke, and townspeople following with candles in hand. These processions were not just spiritual events, they were also public gatherings where the city's social order was on quiet display. Wealthy families stood on balconies draped with embroidered cloths, their vantage points shaded and cool. The poor followed on foot, barefoot or in worn sandals, their candles flickering in the breeze. The soldiers marched in step, muskets slung at their sides, their presence both ceremonial and protective. In the evenings, smaller gatherings took place in neighborhood chapels. These were humbler than the great cathedral but no less important to their communities. Here, prayers might be offered for a safe voyage, for the recovery of a sick child, or in thanksgiving for a ship's return. A wooden bench, a small altar with flowers, and the soft murmur of voices created a space as intimate as any home courtyard. Religion also extended into the rhythms of the dockside. Sailors might make the sign of the cross before stepping aboard. Captains would sometimes request a blessing for their voyage. Icons of saints were kept in storerooms and merchant offices, their painted eyes watching over ledgers and cargo. Even the tides and weather could be spoken of in terms of divine will, a calm sea seen as a blessing, a storm as a trial to be endured. At night, when the bells tolled for the last time, their sound drifted out over the bay. The harbor water reflected the faint light from the city, and for a moment, even the ships at anchor seemed to be listening. In Cartagena, faith was not a separate sphere from daily life, it was stitched into it, as constant as the sea breeze, as unhurried and enduring as the toll of the bells themselves. Beneath Cartagena's bright sun and bustling harbor, another reality shaped the city's wealth, one that moved quietly through its streets yet left a deep mark on its history. For more than 2 centuries, Cartagena was one of the principal slave ports in the Spanish Americas, a place where human lives were bought and sold alongside the sugar, gold, and tobacco that filled the ship's holds. The slave market stood not far from the main docks. Its location was practical, close enough for ships arriving from across the Atlantic to unload their human cargo without long overland transport. The plaza where sales took place was paved in uneven stone, the buildings around it casting just enough shade to cut the glare. From a distance, the market could be mistaken for any other gathering of traders. But here, the goods were people, men, women, and children taken from Africa's west coast, brought across the ocean on voyages that could last months. The air in the market was heavy, especially by late morning. Merchants in wide-brimmed hats stood in clusters, speaking in low tones, their ledgers tucked beneath one arm. Buyers examined those brought ashore with the same practiced eyes they used for livestock or cargo, looking at hands for calluses, at shoulders for strength, at eyes for signs of illness. Contracts were drawn up on thick paper, signed with loops of ink, sealed with wax. The city regulated the trade. Notaries recorded each sale, ensuring taxes were collected for the crown. Priests baptized the enslaved, marking their entry into the colonial record not only as property but as souls under the care of the church. For the enslaved, these rituals were hollow in their power but inescapable in their reach. Once sold, people were dispersed throughout the city and beyond. Some were sent to work in households as cooks, cleaners, and servants. Others labored in workshops, carrying heavy loads or tending fires. Many were dispatched to the fields outside Cartagena or the mines farther inland. For those who remained near the port, the work was often tied to the ships, loading and unloading cargo, repairing hulls, hauling water. In the evenings, after the market had emptied, the plaza would return to stillness. The sound of footsteps faded, replaced by the calls of street vendors and the distant clatter of taverns. Yet for those sold here, the day's transactions would shape years, even lifetimes. The market stones, warmed all day by the sun, seemed to hold the weight of what had passed over them. Cartagena's wealth and its role in the Spanish Empire were built in part on this trade. It was a reality known to all who lived here, from the merchants who profited, to the sailors who carried the human cargo, to the dock workers who labored beside the enslaved in the same unrelenting heat. In the city's archives, the records remain: names, prices, ages, and brief descriptions, preserved in faded ink. Today, the plaza where the slave market once stood is quieter, its past marked by stone and plaque. But in the time of colonial Cartagena, it was a place where the global currents of commerce and empire were most starkly visible, a reminder that the city's bustling harbor and elegant merchant houses were only one face of its history. Step away from the harbor and through the heavy wooden doors of Cartagena's grand houses, and you enter a different world entirely, one that feels almost insulated from the heat, noise, and labor of the port outside. These homes belong to the city's wealthiest merchants, officials, and military officers. Built of thick masonry to keep out the sun's heat, they were designed as both private residences and statements of status. Inside, a wide entrance hall opened onto a central courtyard, the heart of the home. Here, tall palm trees or flowering shrubs grew in the dappled light, and a stone fountain murmured quietly in the center. The air was cooler here, shaded by the surrounding walls and open to the sky above. The sound of the fountain mixed with the faint chirping of birds kept in cages or allowed to flit through the garden. The rooms around the courtyard were high-ceilinged, their walls painted in soft tones and sometimes decorated with imported tiles. Floors were often of polished stone, cool underfoot even on the hottest days. In the reception rooms, carved wooden furniture was arranged around low tables, where porcelain cups might be set out for afternoon chocolate. Windows were covered with wooden latticework, allowing a breeze to pass through while keeping the interior private from the street. Household life here ran on a schedule carefully maintained by servants. The day began early, with the opening of shutters to admit the morning air. Breakfast might consist of bread with cheese, or fruit served on glazed ceramic plates, accompanied by hot chocolate or coffee. In the kitchen, often located toward the back of the house, cooks prepared meals over open hearths, the smell of simmering stews and baking bread drifting into the courtyard. Clothing for the elite was a clear marker of status. Men wore fine linen shirts, waistcoats, and tailored coats even in the heat, their fabrics light but their cuts elaborate. Women's dresses were made from imported silks or cottons, sometimes layered with lace brought from Spain. Jewelry, gold earrings, pearl necklaces, silver hair combs, was worn not only for adornment but as a quiet display of wealth. In the afternoons, when the heat was strongest, the household slowed. Shutters were drawn to dim the rooms, and the family might retreat to shaded areas to read, write letters, or rest. Servants moved quietly through the house, sweeping floors, tending plants, or carrying trays of cool drinks. Outside, the streets might be nearly empty, the city hushed except for the distant toll of a church bell. Social life among the elite was often carried out indoors or in carefully chosen public settings. Visitors were received in the best rooms, where chairs with woven cane seats were arranged in a formal circle. Conversations touched on trade, politics, and family alliances, often over a glass of imported wine. On special occasions, the family might host a dinner, the table set with polished silver and dishes of fish, roasted meat, and sweet preserves. For the children of these households, education and manners were central. Tutors might teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and the catechism. Young women were trained in household management and needlework, while young men were prepared for careers in trade, the church, or the military. From the outside, these homes gave little away: high walls, heavy doors, and shuttered windows keeping their interiors hidden from public view. But within, they were worlds of measured comfort and control, shaped by the rhythms of both the Caribbean climate and the expectations of colonial society. While life here was far removed from the sweat of the docks or the dust of the market, it was still tied to them, for the goods that filled these houses, the food that graced their tables, and the wealth that sustained them all came from the labor of others, from the port's restless, unending tide of ships and trade. By the time dawn broke over Cartagena once again, the cycle was ready to begin anew. The first light painted the harbor in soft tones of pink and pale gold, and the sea lay almost still, the tide breathing slowly in and out against the stone quays. In this quiet hour, before the real heat began, the docks seemed almost at rest, but the stillness was only an illusion. From the narrow streets leading down to the water, the day's laborers began to appear. Some carried their tools slung over one shoulder, others arrived empty-handed, knowing their work would be dictated by whatever ship lay in need of unloading. They greeted each other with nods or brief words, the familiarity of shared routine requiring little more. The smell of brine was sharper in the morning, mingled with the faint smoke of cooking fires from the city above. The ships themselves were waking too. Canvas was unfurled to catch the early breeze, decks were scrubbed with seawater, and cargo hatches creaked open. Seabirds circled lazily overhead, their calls cutting through the low rumble of voices. Somewhere, a boatswain's whistle shrilled, and the steady rhythm of work began to build. Today's cargo might be barrels of sugar bound for Spain, or sacks of coffee arriving from the interior. It could be a shipment of wine, carefully packed in straw-lined crates, or bundles of wool cloth to be sold in the merchant quarter. Each item passed through many hands, from the ship's hold, across the gangplank, onto the quay, and finally into carts or storerooms. The work was physical and repetitive, but it was also the lifeline of the city. Around the edges of the dock, small trades flourished. Vendors sold cups of strong, sweet coffee to the laborers, or small bundles of fried plantains wrapped in paper. A boy ran errands for a ship's captain, a carpenter hammered together a replacement crate. The hum of commerce was constant, from the shouts of the overseers to the creak of wagon wheels rolling toward the market. By mid-morning, the sun was high and the heat pressed down with familiar weight. Sweat soaked through shirts, hands grew raw from ropes and rough wood, and muscles ached from lifting. Yet the pace did not slow. For every ship unloaded, another arrived. For every crate stacked neatly on the quay, another was carried down from the deck. The dock's rhythm was as steady as the tide, a measured beat of labor and movement that underpinned the life of the entire city. From the vantage point of the city walls, one could see how all the pieces fit together. The merchant quarter waited just inland, ready to store and sell what the docks brought in. The church's towers rose above the rooftops, their bells marking the hours for those at sea and on land. The great houses stood quiet behind their high walls, their kitchens stocked and their storerooms full because of the goods carried here. Even the taverns and small courtyards of the common neighborhoods depended on this flow, the dock workers' wages and the sailors' pay finding their way into bread, drink, and music. As afternoon approached, the light shifted again, softening into the warm gold that seemed to linger over the Caribbean. The day's labor neared its end, though there were always a few last crates to be shifted, a few ropes to be coiled before the watch was changed. And then, in the evening calm, the docks grew quiet. The gulls settled on the pilings, the tide lapped gently against the quay, and the men who had carried the weight of the day's work vanished into the city's streets. Some would head to taverns, others to their homes, others still to the open plazas where the night air moved more freely. The port rested, but it never truly slept. Even in the stillness, the faint creak of a ship's rigging or the distant roll of waves was a reminder. At first light, the cycle would begin again, as it had for years, and as it would for many more. Cartagena in the colonial era was a city of contrasts, each part tied to the others. The docks and their laborers bore the weight of the empire's ambitions. The merchant quarter counted and guarded the wealth that flowed through the port. The grand houses enjoyed the comfort that trade provided, while the churches, the processions, and even the taverns gave the city its human rhythm. Some of these worlds barely touched, others overlapped every day. But all were bound together by the same tide, the endless movement of ships, goods, and people through the harbor's gates. In that way, the dock was not only the city's busiest place, but also its quiet anchor, the place where every story began and ended. And as you imagine the soft lap of water against stone, the slow roll of a ship at anchor, and the warm breeze carrying the scent of salt and distant rain, you might feel, just for a moment, the calm that comes with knowing that tomorrow will bring the same familiar rhythm again. Far in the northern reaches of what is now Colombia, long before the arrival of Spanish ships on the horizon, the Tayrona civilization thrived between lush coastal shores and steep, forested mountains. The Tayrona were skilled farmers, builders, and artisans. But among them was a particular group who lived their lives in constant motion, the traders. They were the lifelines between the hot, salt-scented beaches of the Caribbean and the cool, mist-wrapped villages of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. Their duty was to keep goods moving along narrow paths that wound like threads between different worlds. It was not a simple job. It was not a comfortable job. And it was not a job for the faint of heart. As you settle in, imagine the soft sound of the waves far below, fading into the steady hum of insects in the dense jungle canopy. Picture the dim light of early dawn filtering through palm fronds, the air already heavy with moisture. Somewhere ahead, the path climbs into the mountains, disappearing into a green that seems endless. This is where our journey begins, at the side of a Tayrona trader, shouldering the burdens of his people, moving step by steady step into the heart of a land both breathtaking and treacherous. Imagine yourself waking before the sun has fully risen, in a small coastal settlement. Your sleeping mat is woven from palm fibers, and as you roll it aside, you feel the coolness of the packed earth beneath your bare feet. The air is dense with the smell of salt from the sea and the faint, lingering smoke of last night's cooking fire. Your day begins with the slow packing of goods, not just a few small items, but heavy bundles of salt in clay containers, baskets filled with dried fish, and finely worked shell ornaments that glitter faintly in the morning light. Each piece represents a promise, a trade to be made, a partnership to be kept, an obligation to the community. You do not have a mule, a cart, or even a simple wheelbarrow. The Tayrona trade routes were narrow, steep, and often slippery with rain, impossible for wheeled transport. Everything you carry will be strapped across your back or balanced across your shoulders. The woven carrying strap cuts slightly into your forehead, a common technique to bear the load, transferring weight from your spine to your skull. It's efficient, but over long days, the strain leaves your neck stiff and aching. The journey ahead will take weeks. You know the route well, every bend in the path, every small stream that must be crossed, every sudden rise where your thighs will burn from the climb. But knowing the road doesn't make it easier. The first hours pass under the low, heavy heat of the coastal plain. The humidity clings to your skin, making the fabric around your waist feel damp. Insects swarm where the sweat gathers at your temples, and you swipe at them without thinking. Soon the path enters the dense green of the lowland jungle. The air grows darker, filtered through layers of leaves. Here, the danger is not from the sun, but from the ground itself. Hidden among the leaves could be a coiled snake, its patterned scales blending perfectly with the forest floor. One misstep, and the journey could end in fever and swelling within a day. But snakes are not the only living hazard. There are the silent eyes of jaguars, rarely seen but always present in stories passed among traders. There are biting insects that carry sickness. There are plants whose sap will burn the skin. And then, there are other people, not all of them friendly. The Tayrona lived in a region where alliances and rivalries shifted like the flow of a river. While some neighboring groups welcomed trade, others saw travelers as opportunities, for theft, for revenge, or for proving strength. A lone trader could vanish into the forest, his goods never seen again. For this reason, you often travel with others. Small groups offer safety, though they move more slowly, each member adjusting to the pace of the slowest. The sound of the jungle is constant. The low hum of insects, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the occasional distant call of a bird. It is almost hypnotic, and you find yourself moving to its rhythm. Step, breath, shift the weight, step, breath, shift the weight. As the days pass, the terrain begins to change. The jungle thins, giving way to steeper ground. The air cools slightly, but now the path narrows even more, skirting the edges of ravines where water rushes far below. One wrong step here would mean tumbling into the rocks, your load scattering into the river. You camp where you can, often in small clearings or on patches of level ground beside streams. Nights are dark, the kind of darkness that feels almost solid. Fires are small, meant for cooking and a little warmth, but never so bright as to draw attention from unwanted visitors. Food is simple: roasted plantains, boiled maize, dried fish softened in water. There is no luxury on the road. Every bite is fuel, every swallow a calculation of how much you can spare for the day. Days blur together. The monotony is broken only by moments of tension: a sudden sound in the trees, a cloud of insects rising from the ground, a narrow crossing over a slick log bridge. You learn to keep your eyes moving, to trust your companions, and to pace your body so that it will not fail you when the climb grows steep. And still, the loads grow no lighter. Every step upward takes you closer to the highland villages, but also deeper into the ache in your muscles. Traders speak of this ache without complaint. It is as much a part of the job as the goods themselves. For the Tayrona trader, the journey was more than just moving items from one place to another. It was a lifeline, a bridge between communities separated by geography but united by the steady flow of goods. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and often thankless, but without it, the Tayrona world would have been smaller, poorer, and more isolated. As you crest another ridge and the path levels for a moment, you glance back toward the distant shimmer of the sea. You know you will see it again only after many days, when your loads have been delivered and new goods taken up for the return journey. For now, you turn your gaze forward, into the cool shadows of the mountains. As you follow the winding path higher into the mountains, it's easy to imagine the journey as a simple delivery, one village sending goods to another. But the reality was far more intricate. The Tayrona world was a web of exchange that connected two dramatically different environments: the hot, breezy Caribbean coastline and the cool, misty highlands of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. Between them lay not just distance, but deep contrasts in what each place could produce. On the coast, the sea gave generously. Fish, dried carefully under the sun, could be stored for weeks without spoiling. Shells, especially the gleaming white and pink ones from certain mollusks, were prized for ornamentation. And most importantly, there was salt. Salt was more than seasoning. It was preservation. Without it, meat and fish could not be stored for the long months when fresh catches were impossible. Salt made feasts possible and trade practical. In a warm, humid climate, salt was as valuable as any precious metal. Coastal communities harvested it by evaporating seawater in shallow pans, scraping up the crystals, and packing them tightly for transport. In the highlands, there were different treasures. The slopes of the Sierra Nevada offered fertile soils for maize, beans, and root crops. The cooler air was perfect for growing certain fruits and plants that could not survive at sea level. And hidden in riverbeds and streams, highland people found flecks and nuggets of gold, which the Tayrona shaped into intricate jewelry and ceremonial objects. Gold flowed down from the mountains, salt flowed up from the coast, and along the way countless other goods changed hands. Cocoa beans from the foothills, cotton textiles woven with skill and patience, colorful feather ornaments, and polished stone tools all moved along the same routes. But trade among the Tayrona was not just an economic transaction. It was a relationship. Each delivery of goods was part of an ongoing exchange of trust, obligation, and sometimes diplomacy. In a world without written contracts, agreements were remembered in the minds of elders and leaders, passed down like stories. Breaking them could mean more than losing a customer. It could damage alliances that had taken generations to build. When traders from the coast arrived in a highland village, they did not simply drop off their goods and move on. They stayed, sharing food and stories. They might join in a community ceremony or bring messages from distant relatives. In this way, the trade routes carried not only goods, but news, traditions, and cultural threads that tied the Tayrona world together. Imagine the moment when two groups meet on the path, one from the highlands, one from the coast. They pause in a small clearing, setting down their loads. Baskets are untied, pots are uncovered, and goods are inspected under the dappled light filtering through the trees. There is no rush. The air smells faintly of crushed leaves and damp earth. Someone offers a piece of roasted maize cake, another passes a gourd of cool water. The goods are exchanged, but so are smiles, nods, and the subtle recognition that both parties have kept their end of the bargain. Such exchanges were part of a larger network that extended far beyond what a single trader could see. The Tayrona were not isolated. Their goods traveled through intermediaries to other coastal peoples, and in return, exotic items sometimes found their way back, stones from distant river valleys, shells from farther down the coast, perhaps even objects traded indirectly from lands the Tayrona themselves never visited. The network was not without its tensions. Disputes could arise over the quality of goods, over delayed deliveries, or over changes in alliances between communities. Yet, the trade endured. The need for each other's products outweighed the risks of conflict. The coastal exchange also shaped the Tayrona settlements. Villages were often positioned at points where goods could be gathered, redistributed, or stored before continuing along the route. Some grew into important waypoints, bustling with travelers and temporary markets. Others were smaller, quiet resting spots known only to those who used them. At its heart, the great coastal exchange was as much about connection as it was about commerce. Each journey tied the mountains and the sea a little closer, weaving together the lives of farmers, fishers, artisans, and merchants into a single fabric. As you walk along the path, the salt-heavy bundles on your back are not just commodities, they are a link in a chain that stretches across landscapes and generations. With each careful step, you are carrying not only the weight of your goods, but the quiet, enduring rhythm of a civilization sustained by movement. And just as the trade routes brought goods and stories between coast and highlands, they also opened the door to something more mysterious, the possibility that Tayrona traders, or their ancestors, were not bound only to land. For there are whispers, scattered like grains of sand in the archaeological record, of journeys that ventured far beyond the sight of the shore. By the time you've spent enough years walking the trade paths between the mountains and the coast, you begin to notice that the world does not end at the water's edge. The Caribbean horizon is a soft, endless line, shifting from pale turquoise near the shore to deep blue far out at sea. Some days, it is perfectly still, like a sheet of hammered metal catching the sun. Other days, it rises and falls in long, rolling swells that break in white foam upon the rocks. For most traders, the path was the domain of their work, the steep climbs, the jungle crossings, the careful navigation of ravines and streams. But there are traces, scattered in both history and archaeology, that suggest the Tayrona's exchange network may have once extended across the water as well. Archaeologists have uncovered hints, a particular kind of shell that does not grow in Tayrona waters, appearing in inland sites. Carved objects made from exotic woods, unlikely to have drifted here on their own. And there are accounts from early Spanish chroniclers, brief and passing, describing the Tayrona and their neighbors as skilled at building and using rafts to move along the coast. These were not delicate canoes made for rivers, but large seaworthy balsas, rafts built of sturdy logs, lashed together with fibers and reinforced with crossbeams. Their decks were wide enough to carry both people and cargo. Sails, woven from cotton, could catch the constant trade winds, allowing for travel that was faster than paddling alone. The details of their construction are elusive. The sea, as generous as it can be, does not preserve wood well over centuries. Most of what we imagine comes from descriptions of similar vessels in neighboring cultures, and from the logic of what would be required to survive along the coast. The Tayrona coastline is not a gentle one, much of it is rocky, with hidden currents and sudden shifts in weather. To navigate it safely would have required knowledge passed down carefully through generations. Imagine standing on a headland, watching such a raft approach. It rides low in the water, the logs bound tightly so they move as one. The sail is a pale, square sheet, catching the steady wind. The crew works quietly, adjusting ropes, watching the way the waves change as they near the shore. On deck are baskets of dried fish, jars of salt, and perhaps a small pouch of gold dust wrapped in cotton cloth. To step aboard would have been to enter another rhythm entirely. The rocking of the raft replaces the steady beat of footsteps. The air is cooler, touched by the salt spray. The scent of the jungle fades, replaced by the clean, open smell of the sea. Journeys along the coast could connect Tayrona ports with distant settlements, perhaps other Arawak-speaking peoples, or even cultures whose languages and customs were unfamiliar. The sea allowed goods to move in ways the mountains could not, bypassing days of climbing and descending. But it also held dangers. Storms could rise with little warning. Currents could pull a raft away from sight of land. And unlike the forest path, where one could at least stop and rest, the sea offered no place to pause except on the decks of the vessel itself. It is possible that much of this maritime skill was lost, or at least greatly reduced, in the years before Spanish contact. Some believe that changes in political alliances or threats from rival coastal groups made long-distance sea trade less safe. Others suggest that the Tayrona focused more heavily on their land-based networks, relying on the intricate web of mountain and coastal paths that we have already traced. Yet the traces remain, a reminder that the Tayrona were not confined to a single way of moving through their world. They adapted to their landscape, whether it was the steep ascent of a mountain path or the shifting swells of the Caribbean Sea. The mystery lies in what we cannot fully reconstruct. How far did they travel? How large were their vessels? What stories did they bring back from distant shores? The answers have been softened and blurred by centuries, like footprints in wet sand slowly erased by the tide. As you walk again along the coastal path, the salt-heavy breeze on your skin, it is easy to imagine the low, steady shape of a raft sliding along the horizon, a reminder that for some Tayrona traders, the journey was not only over land, but also across the restless, open water. And while some traders risked the waves, others, through long years of carrying heavy loads and managing complex exchanges, reached a level of success that lifted them far above the hardships of the road. They became part of a world that could not be more different from the mosquito-filled camps and steep, muddy paths, a world of comfort, abundance, and influence. After years, perhaps decades, of walking the narrow paths between the sea and the mountains, of braving snakes in the undergrowth and sudden storms along the coast, a Tayrona trader could achieve something rare. Success in this world was not measured in coins, but in the strength of one's alliances, the quality of one's goods, and the network of people who owed you favors. Those who managed their routes well, kept their promises, and navigated the shifting politics of neighboring groups could rise into the small but powerful circle of merchant elites. For these few, life slowed. The long days of carrying heavy salt jars up steep trails gave way to overseeing others who made the journey on their behalf. Their homes were no longer simple palm-thatched shelters by the roadside, but carefully built stone terraces, positioned to catch the best light and air. From such a terrace, one could look out over a wide valley, green with maize fields and dotted with fruit trees, the mountains rising in layered shades of blue beyond. It was in these homes that the banquets took place. These were not the rushed meals of the road, eaten by firelight before collapsing into sleep. They were gatherings meant to display abundance, cement alliances, and quietly remind guests of the host's success. Imagine the approach to such an evening. The stone paths leading up to the terrace are lined with clay lamps, their flames flickering against the night air. The scent of roasting meat drifts down to meet you long before you arrive. Music, soft, steady rhythms tapped on hollow logs and played on simple flutes, drifts through the darkness. The guests arrive slowly, in groups. Some are fellow traders, others are leaders of nearby villages, skilled artisans, or spiritual authorities. Greetings are warm but measured. This is a space where appearances matter. The meal itself is laid out on woven mats and low platforms. Baskets overflow with roasted maize, each kernel glistening with oil. Clay pots hold thick stews of beans and tubers, their surfaces shimmering in the firelight. There are platters of fish wrapped in banana leaves, slow-cooked until tender. Bowls of tropical fruits, guava, papaya, and small sweet bananas, provide bursts of color among the earth-tone pottery. For drink, there is chicha, a fermented maize beverage, served in carved gourds, its flavor rich and slightly tangy. Passing a gourd from hand to hand is part of the ritual, a quiet reminder that wealth is meant to be shared, not hoarded. Conversation moves at an unhurried pace. The talk might turn to trade, the latest harvests, the reliability of certain routes, the possibility of expanding exchanges with a distant community. But just as often, the discussion drifts into stories, the retelling of journeys, the memory of unusual encounters on the path, the subtle weaving of personal achievements into the fabric of shared history. The wealth of the merchant elite is visible not only in the food, but in the surroundings. Polished stone walls reflect the light of the fire. Clay vessels are painted with intricate designs, each pattern carrying meaning. Gold ornaments, worn sparingly, catch the flicker of the lamps. The host moves among the guests, ensuring everyone's gourd is full, their plate replenished. This is not simply hospitality, it is the careful maintenance of influence. For all their comfort, these elites still depend on the same network of traders and routes that shaped their rise. Without the flow of salt, gold, fish, textiles, and countless smaller goods, the banquets would be impossible. In this way, the merchant elite remain tied to the rhythm of the trade, even if their feet no longer walk the path each day. As the evening deepens, music swells softly and the cool mountain air settles over the terrace. Lamps burn low, and guests, warmed by food and drink, linger in conversation. The banquet becomes not just a meal, but a reaffirmation of the connections that keep the Tayrona world alive. Eventually, the gathering will end. Guests will depart along the lamplit paths, some to nearby homes, others beginning the long journey down to the coast or farther into the mountains. The host will watch them go, knowing that each one leaves with a full belly, a renewed bond, and a memory of the night's generosity. In the quiet that follows, the fire dies to embers. Somewhere in the distance, a river whispers over stones, the same river that traders follow on their journeys. The life of a Tayrona merchant elite may be far removed from the dangers of the road, but it is still built upon it. Every banquet, every gold ornament, every warm night of music and conversation rests on the weary footsteps of those who came before. As our journey with the Tayrona traders draws to a close, we find ourselves once again at the meeting place between mountains and sea. The salt breeze carries the scent of the coast, while the distant peaks are wrapped in the cool, soft haze of evening. The same routes we followed in our imagination, steep forest trails, winding coastal paths, perhaps even the uncertain sweep of the open water, have been walked countless times before, their rhythms echoing across centuries. The life of a Tayrona trader was never simple. From the first heavy steps under the weight of salt and dried fish, to the careful negotiation of exchanges between communities, to the rare nights of abundance in the homes of the merchant elite, every moment was part of a larger, intricate web. The work demanded endurance, caution, and skill, but it also created connection. Through their steady, determined movement, these traders carried more than goods. They carried news, traditions, and the quiet threads of alliance that kept distant villages bound together. They moved between worlds, from the hot glare of the coastline to the cool shade of the highlands, from the hum of the forest to the whisper of the waves. Much has faded. The exact design of their sea rafts, the full map of their routes, the details of their ceremonies, these remain half-hidden, softened by time. But the essence of their work remains in the traces they left behind, in the shells found far inland, in the gold that once traveled down from the mountains, in the memory of paths carved into the land. Tonight, as you drift into rest, you might picture yourself sitting at the edge of a stone terrace, looking out over the darkening forest. Somewhere below, a narrow path winds toward the coast. In the distance, the last light of the sun catches on the surface of the sea. The air is still, and the weight of the day's journey has eased from your shoulders. The Tayrona traders' world was one of movement, of patience, and of quiet persistence. And though the routes they walked have grown over with time, their legacy is still there, in the landscapes, in the stories, and perhaps in the enduring truth that the most important journeys are not always the easiest ones. So let the sound of those ancient footsteps fade now, like the tide pulling gently from the shore. Rest here, in the calm between the mountains and the sea, where the work is done and the night has settled.